Everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm Izzy from English with Izzy. I'm your B2 First and C1 Advanced Cambridge exam preparation teacher, but I also teach B2, C1 and C2 really fun general English classes. I'm also a huge coffee enthusiast, so if coffee does not run through your veins like blood does, get out. Today, we're going to be diving into the Cambridge C1 Advanced Writing paper and talking about 6 of the most common mistakes that students make. And spoiler alert, it's not just forgetting your pen on exam day, but we're going to look at really common mistakes that I see my students make all the time, and I want to make sure that you don't fall into the same trap. So grab a tea, if you're feeling fancy, grab a coffee, and let's get started. Okay, so a quick refresher before we jump into the nitty-gritty. The C1 Advanced Writing paper has 2 parts and you have 1.5 hours to do it. Part 1 is an essay and it's compulsory, so you cannot run away from that one. Part 2 is a choice between different types of writing. They're going to give you 3 options in the exam, but it could be between a letter, which could be formal or informal, a proposal, a report, or a review. Now, each one has its own quirks, its own personality, if you will. And if you're looking for some extra help in the writing exam because you have no idea what you're doing, my C1 Advanced Writing Guide contains absolutely everything you need to know to get those top marks in your writing exam. So let's start with common mistake number 1, which is not addressing the task fully, or in other words, not properly answering the question. This is what I like to call mistake numero uno. This is like ordering a pizza and only getting the crust. I mean, the crust is great, but what about the toppings? That's the reason you order the pizza, right? So imagine, for example, the task is to write an essay discussing the advantages and disadvantages of working from home. And you end up talking only about how great it is to work in pajamas. Sure, we love cozy pajamas. Am I wearing pajama bottoms? You'll never know. But you've got to discuss both sides. You can't just discuss one side of the argument. A great way to avoid this is by really reading the task carefully and underlining key points that you need to cover. Because a C1 essay is always going to ask you to talk about 2 points and to choose one over the other. So please make sure that you talk about both, you talk about them in detail, and that you answer the question properly. Remember that the examiner is really looking for depth. They're looking for you to really explain your idea. So don't just write a superficial answer. Give really good points and explain them and give examples. Mistake number 2 is poor structure and poor organization. And organization is worth 25% of your marks in the writing exam, so it is really important. Now, having poor structure or little organization in your writing is kind of like trying to put together a piece of IKEA furniture and not having the instructions. It's going to be chaos and confusion. Let's say you're writing a report, for example. First, you write your recommendations, then you jump into your introduction. Somewhere in the middle, you give your suggestions. You know, it's kind of like a roller coaster ride, but it's not a fun one. Your text should be logical, it should be structured, it should be ordered, and there is a very specific way to do all of these writings, and you have to know exactly what you should be writing in each of these paragraphs. Now, how can you avoid this roller coaster chaos that I mentioned before? Well, the first thing you need to do is stick to a clear structure. So always start with an introduction. Then you're going to have your main body paragraphs where you develop your main ideas. And at the end, especially with essays, you're always going to want a conclusion that summarizes your ideas and makes your final opinion crystal clear. Common mistake number 3 is writing your text in an inappropriate tone or register. Imagine, for example, you are invited to a black tie event and somebody shows up in trainers, or worse, in flip-flops. It's awkward, right? And it doesn't feel right. So imagine for part 2 of the writing exam, you choose to write a formal letter to a company. And you start with, hey there, how's it going? You might throw some phrasal verbs in there, you might put an idiom in there, you might write words like totally and cool. but it's not the professional vibe that you expect from a formal letter. Now, this is really going to knock down your communicative achievement marks because you're not communicating your idea in the way that you're supposed to be writing it. And how can you avoid this problem? Well, always remember who you're writing for. Consider your audience and the reason that you're writing this text. So if you're writing a formal task like a report or a proposal which requires a formal and professional tone, avoid slang and avoid contractions. If you're writing an informal letter or an email to a friend, make sure that it's nice and relaxed and that the tone is neutral or informal, because you're not going to write to your best friend and say, "Dear sir or madam, to who it may concern." It sounds pompous and it's just not appropriate for the context. Now, common mistake number 4 is inconsistent or incorrect use of language. This is like mixing up salt and sugar. Now, if you're using a lot of one, you're probably not going to be using the other, right? Either you're making a coffee with sugar in it. I can't believe I just said that. Coffee with sugar is a crime. Okay, either you're making a brownie, for example, which is sweet with sugar. You're not going to put a lot of salt in there because it's going to ruin the flavor. So imagine, for example, you start your essay using British spelling, right? You're putting lots of S's instead of your Z's, and then you throw in some American English words. This is not natural and it should be avoided. Sometimes people don't have problems though mixing up British and American English, but they make lots of spelling mistakes. Like they'll mix up the word effect or affect, and that can be a problem. So the first thing to do is decide on if you're learning British English or American English, and if you realize that you also make a lot of spelling mistakes, write down word pairs and commonly confused words so you can avoid them in the future. Mistake number 5 is one that I see all the time, which is lack of supporting details and examples. This is like serving pasta without sauce, right? It's boring, it's bland, and it's incomplete. Now, if we go back to the essay that I talked about at the beginning, and you say that working from home increases productivity, but you don't explain why, or you don't explain how, you're leaving the examiner hungry for more details, right? So make your point, give extra information, and also give examples. PEE. Point, explanation, example. This is one of the strategies I mentioned both in my online course and also in my C1 writing guide, which honestly is one of the best things I've ever created. So what can you do to make sure that your essay is complete and full of examples? Well, make sure that every time you make a point, you back it up with an example, a statistic, maybe a personal experience if it's appropriate, just like when you're choosing what you want on your pizza, right? Adding that pepperoni, adding those red onion slices, delicious, makes all the difference, right? It makes your pizza more complete. And if you're a margarita kind of person, get out. Last but not least, common mistake number 6 is going off topic. It's like going to the supermarket, for example, for milk and coming back with everything else but not the milk. It's frustrating for the person who wanted the milk, and it's frustrating for the examiners who are looking for an answer and you're not giving them what they're looking for. Now, it's important to make sure that everything we write is relevant to the question, because if we're writing irrelevant things, that's really going to affect your content marks. Your content marks are worth a quarter or 25% of your writing marks. So if the content, the ideas are not what they're asking you, you might not be very happy with your marks. So how can we avoid this problem? Well, the best way to do so, as I mentioned at the beginning, is to plan your writings. If you know from the very beginning what you're going to be writing in each paragraph, there is very little chance that you're going to include unnecessary information or that you're going to forget the things that you have to be writing about. So planning is the most important thing that you can do, and also underlining the task on the exam paper so you know exactly what they're asking from you and you can plan your writings accordingly. I want to remind you guys that I have a C1 advanced sample course, which will give you some of my step-by-step strategies so you know exactly how to face each of these parts of the exam. And don't forget that when it comes to the C1 advanced exam, there are 2 things that we really have to pay attention to. Making sure that your language is good, so knowing your vocabulary, knowing your grammar, but also knowing how to play the Cambridge game. You need to know exactly what the examiners are looking for so that when you're giving your answers, you're writing your text, you're speaking in the speaking exam, you know how to get those marks and you can feel confident going into the exam, and more importantly, so you can get that C1 Advanced certificate. To get those strategies, either have a look at my C1 Advanced Writing Guide, which has everything you need to know to pass your writing exam and feel confident about what to write. If you need help with all parts of the exam, I'll drop my free C1 Advanced sample course up here, and I'll also leave everything in the description box below. Now, last but not least, I want to say thank you guys for watching. If you found this video helpful, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe so you get a reminder of when new videos come out. Hitting that thumbs up button is kind of like giving me a virtual hug, because it's a way to show me that you support these videos and also help the YouTube algorithm send these kinds of videos to people who also need help with their English exam. Anyway, that's it for today. Stay curious, stay learning.